We now have the BitMEX CEO, the new CEO, coming out and saying that they believe that there will be 5 countries that will adopt Bitcoin by end of year. BitMEX CEO Alexander Hopner thinks countries in the developing world will soon follow the footsteps of El Salvador. He explicitly has come out and said 2 things. One, he said, quote, "My prediction is that by the end of the next year, we'll have at least 5 countries that accept Bitcoin as legal tender. All of them will be developing countries." So by the end of 2022, I'm sorry, not 2021, by the end of 2022. Then he says, quote, "Vitalik and I can agree to disagree on this one." Speaking about Vitalik's recent comments on Bitcoin in El Salvador, he said, "I celebrate the move towards mass market adoption of crypto in El Salvador, and what will start with Bitcoin will quickly diversify. Of course, a move like this attracts criticism and will never be perfect either, but the overall direction is undeniably positive." Now, when we think about this, the idea that El Salvador has come and adopted Bitcoin as legal tender, I think people are really excited about that. We've also seen countries like Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina, and many others, various politicians, whether they're on the local level or on the national level, all start to talk about following suit. And so the idea that we're going to get 5 more countries by the end of 2022, in my opinion, is actually probably pretty realistic. I don't know exactly if it's 5, or if it's 6 or 4, and I don't know if it's by June of 2022 or December, but it feels like over the next 12 months or so, there will be a handful of other countries that start to participate. Now, that participation can be in many different forms. It could be as accepting the digital currency as legal tender. It could be deciding to put the digital currency on their balance sheet of their central bank. It could also be accepting Bitcoin and the digital currency as some form of payment in terms of paying their employees or letting people pay their taxes and fees. There's all kinds of different ways that they can participate. And it doesn't just have to be about using it as a medium of exchange or a store of value. You also could see countries saying, you know what, we've got lots of energy, whether it's stranded energy or excess energy. We're going to start actually mining Bitcoin as well. And we're going to use that to monetize the power that we have access to and use our very, very low rates in order to become super profitable. And so regardless of how these countries start to participate, it would not be surprising to see 5 or so countries in the next 12 months or so. The question then becomes, where do we get them from? And when you think of a country like El Salvador, it's about 6.5 million people. It's pretty small on the global stage. But if you start to talk about maybe a country like Brazil, which there's been rumblings and rumors about their Bitcoin adoption, that could become much more interesting. Or if you look at a country like the Philippines, where we've seen other types of blockchain-based assets become very popular, if all of a sudden they started to adopt Bitcoin as well, they have over 100 million people from a population standpoint. And so whether it's a small country or a large country, whether it's a developed country or a developing country, I do think that we will see it. What I don't find as easy to wrap my head around is to see one of the superpowers go ahead and start to participate. Even here in the United States, I think that the federal government is unlikely to start to embrace and participate in Bitcoin in any material way. But the beauty of the United States is that it is a union of states. And those individual states actually have more autonomy than most people realize. And so we've seen in Wyoming or Texas or in Florida and many other states around the country that people have become very pro-Bitcoin. And so I think that's where we're going to see the movement most likely, is that the states will start to actually embrace the digital currency and the decentralized open payment rails. We'll start to see politicians realizing that, wait a second, a big portion of my population, of my constituency, they actually own this asset. They care about the ideals and the ethos that are wrapped around the asset. And this asset specifically is good for business. This asset brings jobs to my jurisdiction. It allows us to derive more tax revenue. And on top of that, it also creates economic value. And so if I can create jobs, if I can create economic value, if I can help my constituency actually build a life of financial security, and on top of that, it drives revenue for the government, then it's actually Bitcoin being good for business. And already individuals have realized that. Now corporations and financial institutions are starting to realize it, but eventually even the government, whether it's at the national level, the state level, or even at a local level, talking about Cool Valley, Missouri, and giving out the Bitcoin directly to citizens. My guess is that whether it's 5 countries or more, or whether it's in 12 months or less, It ultimately isn't going to matter. We're going to see everyone capitulate, everyone participate. But it's very interesting to see that the BitMEX CEO now believes 5 countries will adopt Bitcoin before the end of 2022. John, do you agree or disagree with 5 countries by the end of next year?
I don't want to put a number on it, so I do not know how many countries. I believe more go deeper down the rabbit hole of Bitcoin within the next year. I mean, he had some, Alexander had some great points. He is the former CEO of a German exchange. So he understands both macro and micro like environment and markets, but he cited a few things. Remittance payments are going to accelerate the growth in developing countries, high inflation in developing countries, and then also political issues in developing countries. Some of the stats were 75% of low and middle income countries they receive 75% of the remittance payments in the world, which is kind of wild to think about. And then also just high inflation, right? So developed countries, the average inflation that the IMF said was going to be 2.4, and then developing countries, it's going to be 5.4% for 2021. That's a pretty big difference in my opinion.
If you had to guess right now, let's try to guess the 5 countries that are likely to adopt Bitcoin. Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina. What are 2 more? 5 countries that you believe will adopt Bitcoin. Brazil, Ecuador, Argentina. Mexico? Nah.
No.
Colombia? Venezuela?
Venezuela.
Yeah.
Venezuela.
All right, so are we going 4?
I don't know what their political situation is
4
like.
of the 5 countries are all going to be in South America, South and Central America?
I think the thing is like Brazil would be an outlier because they're a massive country, right? When I think they're 6th largest in the world, so they're a much bigger country than El Salvador, 6 million population. But you have to look for a country that has high inflation, obviously, right? Inability to do international remittances, stuff like that. So there's like a few key things you want to look for. And I think the smaller the country, the better, because it's easier to implement and scale, right? So El Salvador, they implemented it, I think, legal tender on September 7th. So we're just over a month now. They have more people that have Bitcoin wallets now than traditional bank accounts. So over half the country, I believe, now has wallets that are active. And Bitcoin's price has appreciated by 25% since that went live, right? So for the first time in their lives, these people have watched their purchasing power actually increase rather than decrease. So I think when you look at it from other countries that are in a similar kind of case and standpoint that El Salvador was in, it's a real model that you can look at and say, hey, look, this is working to some degree, right? And there's obviously going to be price volatility and other things to deal with. And getting people to download kind of your wallets and doing all these things are not easy. And I don't want to say that everything's going to go as well as El Salvador seems to be going. But ultimately, it can be really worth it because El Salvador is putting the blueprint out there. And you can argue all day about whether they should do things or they shouldn't do them or how they're doing them, et cetera. But at the end of the day, more people there have access to international payments at a faster speed and aren't paying the high fees that they were paying through traditional services like Western Union. So I think it's a really good thing. And I think what the best thing that El Salvador has done, really, in my opinion, is the ability to show that this works, right? And they're the first mover. Now it's opening the door for other countries to come in and say, hey, look, we're willing to do this. We see it's already working somewhere else. They're kind of laying down the blueprint. Maybe we change a little thing here or there, but ultimately, we're not going to be given such a hard time by other people on the world stage. And then there is this blueprint that we can follow to actually get this done. So I think whether it's Brazil, whether it's other countries in South America, et cetera, it really doesn't matter. But I would guess that there's probably going to be 3, 4, or 5 countries that do it within the next 12, 24 months.
One country we didn't mention is Panama, which definitely is a possibility. Also, you could see Cuba, potentially the people, not the government, trying to adopt it. If you look at other places like Ukraine or Estonia, you could see them trying to. Lebanon, right? There are some other countries that people were putting in the comments. But if I had to pick the 5 countries that I think will end up actually going ahead and embracing Bitcoin, I'm going to go with Brazil, Panama, Ecuador, Argentina, and my 5th one, the people of Lebanon, not the government.
Why is Argentina on your list?
Super high inflation. I think the annual inflation in Argentina is like 50%. So you're
just going based off inflation. If you have high inflation, you have to find something to.
I believe that Bitcoin adoption at a nation state level, whether it's actually the government embracing it or it's a big portion of the population embracing it, is going to be not driven by a pitch of come buy this asset and you can, quote, make money. I think that investors, a small portion of the population, will be attracted to that. We've seen already 100 plus million people around the world have been attracted to that story. I think that the mass adoption occurs less because people are just randomly running to some asset that they think will appreciate in kind of a fiat currency price, but instead they're running from a really bad situation. They're running from 50% inflation. They're running from being a dollarized country and having censorship be top of mind. They're running from the inability, like in Lebanon right now, for them to actually be able to access their savings because the banks are shutting down and not giving them their money. Right. So when you think of it, whether it is from a confiscation standpoint, whether it's from an inflation standpoint, whether it's from a censorship resistance standpoint, all of these different things, once you've experienced the problems, the value prop of Bitcoin becomes much more obvious. And so I think that the mass adoption occurs not from people just randomly running to it. Instead, they're running from a bad situation. And so what you have to do is to go look to see where that adoption actually occurs. You have to go find where are the places in the world where there's the most kind of bad situation or the most pain around the confiscation of assets, inflation.
Yeah, so you think
resistance.
it's going to be more based off the store value aspect in the medium of exchange?
I think that you have to get people to buy into kind of psychologically that it is a store of value, and then they'll start using it as a medium of exchange, right? There's kind of a sequential thing. You don't just start using it as a medium of exchange without thinking that it's a store of value. And then on top of that too is the whole idea of censorship resistance. There's many people who may come into Bitcoin and use it in some of these countries we're talking about who actually aren't coming because they think it's a store of value or because they think that it's a more superior means of exchange. Instead, they're coming for it because literally it's censorship resistance, or literally if I hold my private keys, no one can take it from me. And so it just depends on what is the situation that you're essentially running from or trying to cure. And then that is why Bitcoin ends up being attractive to you. It's similar. It's this very interesting thing where Bitcoin has so many different value propositions to different people. Bitcoin ultimately ends up being valuable to an individual person for different reasons. And a lot of that is determined by what is the situation that they either have experienced or that they're running.